Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Henry Johnson is a mild-mannered kind of guy. He likes jazz music and ragtime. He doesn't talk too loud. He always has a smile for his friends. But today, the Germans have made him angry. They threw grenades at him. They shot at him. They stabbed him with bayonets and shot him twice in the chest with a revolver. They took his best friend prisoner and are dragging him off to be interrogated. But here's the thing. Sergeant Henry Johnson isn't dead. He's a Harlem Hellfighter, a member of one of the most elite and toughest fighting forces the Americans sent to Europe. And all the Germans have done is made him angry. So he does what a Hellfighter would do. He draws a 12-inch bolo knife from his waist and decides he's gonna go rescue his buddy. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larish. Pat, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm doing okay. It sounds like it's cold where you are. I'm like sweating so bad in here right now. I had to close all the windows to record, and it's just miserable.
Yeah. Yep. Different hemispheres. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I did see a story recently about there was some cruise ship that was supposed to go to the Caribbean, and they ended up in Boston. And everybody was mad, and they tried to sue the cruise line.
Yeah. I mean, nothing against Boston. I mean, I live here. But if you're expecting the Caribbean...
If your suitcase is full of Caribbean clothing, that's like really not the spot.
Yep. Yeah. And, this is New England weather. So chances are it'll cycle through something not hot, but like maybe in the high 40s at some point. But still... Yeah.
Yeah. The coldest I've ever been in my entire life was in Boston. I was walking to work one time, and it was so cold that I had to go into like a post office because I was just dying. I was not going to survive the walk. I was going to freeze to death on the sidewalk. I had to go in there and just like sit down on the floor, like by the P.O. boxes and be like, I'm going to sit here for 5 minutes until I can move my fingers again. I actually think I'm not okay.
Yeah, contemplate the priority mail shipping labels.
Yes. Well, we are going to be doing a pretty cool story today. This is a story that I have been kind of following for years now, I guess I should say, because the person that we are going to talk about today is somebody that I had written about on my website really early on. Like I'd come across the story pretty early in my career of doing the website. I was so happy with the story and the way it came out. I ended up kind of reworking it a bit for the first Badass book. And so this character has a chapter in the first Badass book. But at the time that book was written, he'd received some medals for bravery, but he hadn't received the Medal of Honor. And there had been a campaign at the time to get this guy, higher honors and awards. It was kind of an uphill battle for him for a number of reasons that we'll discuss as we go along. But one cool thing about this story, this character, Henry Johnson, is that since the book was released, he ended up getting his medal upgraded to a Medal of Honor. And there's been some other really cool things that have happened with his story. So it's been really fun to write about this character pretty early on and then see how, other people started picking up the story, or maybe I'm sure I was part of the wave of it getting picked up because he had just received his Distinguished Service Cross when I was writing about him. And then in the 10 years or so beyond that, he got upgraded to the Medal of Honor, which, was kind of cool to be a little, whatever small part of that I could have played to get that going, which was really fun. and I'm excited to talk about it. We have an interesting story today because it's going to cover a lot of interesting things. We're going to talk World War I, and we're going to talk knife fights, but we're also going to talk jazz music, I believe.
Woo.
And we're going to talk, we're going to go back into the neighborhood of Cher Ami, who we've discussed previously.
Cher Ami, our podcast's favorite pigeon.
Yes, we are the podcast's favorite pigeon. Yes. One of the only pigeons we like on this podcast. So we're going to go back to the Argonne Forest, and we're going to go back to World War I, and we're going to talk about Sergeant Henry Johnson and his infantry unit for the U.S. and sometimes French Army, a unit that we know today as the Harlem Hellfighters.
The Harlem Hellfighters. That's a great name.
It's so awesome, right? And for people who played the Call of Duty World War I game, there's a campaign where you play through as them, and that's kind of cool. But so they might be familiar to some people. But we're going to talk about the Harlem Hellfighters, and we're going to talk about one in particular, and his name is Henry Johnson. And we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we are going to get into that story. So stick with us. Henry Johnson was born in 1892 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
I would like to give a shout out to all of our listeners from North Carolina and also South Carolina.
Yes, all of the Carolinas and New York. Most of the story is going to take place in and around New York City or upstate New York. But Henry Johnson being born in 1892 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that is what we know about where he was born, but we don't, and when, but there's some details that have remained fuzzy. We don't know his actual birth date because there are a couple different ones listed, and there's a possibility that it might be being guessed at. I'm not entirely sure on the details of this. One interesting thing about him is that even his name has been kind of, I had always heard it as Henry Lincoln Johnson, and that's how I wrote about him in the book. And if you search that, it pulls up his entry, and it pulls up entries that describe him with that name. But it seems now that his name is William Henry Johnson, which it appears on some of his Army paperwork. We're going to call him Henry Johnson for the purposes of this podcast because that is one thing that we can all agree on is that he went by Henry Johnson.
If you take the Venn diagram of William Henry Johnson and Henry Lincoln Johnson, we've got a Henry, we've got a Johnson. Okay, Henry Johnson.
Yes,
let's roll with that.
We're going to go with Henry Johnson, and 1892 seems like a good bet for his birth year, although we aren't entirely sure on the date. But this is a weird thing about this time period, and it's something that I kind of want to bring up early on when we talk about Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters and their experiences in World War I, is that and I don't know about you, Pat, but when I think about World War I picture it as being relatively close to World War II. I picture, the guys in, modern soldiers fighting a modern war with machine guns and rifles. And I think of it as kind of the modern era.
Yeah, because so much of it was modern.
Right. Yeah. It's the 20th century. There's airplanes, there's cars, there's all this kind of stuff. But and then when I think of the American Civil War, that's the old days. They were fighting with muskets. They were lining up on those big lines. It's a totally different style of fighting. It's a totally different style of people. There's no photograph. There's very few photographs of people from that time period.
There are some photographs, but yeah.
But not like there was in 1914.
Yeah.
So you think of them as being kind of really, really far apart from each other, but they're not, right? So Henry Johnson, he's born in 1892, and that is less than 30 years after the end of the Civil War. That's like one generation, right? There's Civil War veterans that are still alive when he's born and will continue to be into World War I. And so that's how close these things are. And that's how, he's born in North Carolina, and he's not very far removed from almost certainly his parents were born enslaved, right? That is that is how closely he is connected to this stuff. And that is why sometimes it's hard to know the birth date and the birth year and location and all of this stuff, and birth name even.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's a thing that is really worth keeping in mind as we go through the rest of this story, is that these two things are closer than you'd like to think they are. These two time periods are not that far removed. So at some point, relatively early on, Henry Johnson and his family, they moved from North Carolina to New York City. We're going to try to get some new opportunities. Henry Johnson, he's a soft-spoken guy. He's 5'4". He's not a particularly big, giant person. He's not, when we talk about badass warriors from history, you generally picture, a 6'8" Viking, right?
Whoa, Hercules! Whoa.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't picture a 5'4" guy who doesn't talk that loud.
We've got Simo Häyhä, who is like what, 5'2",
something like that.
Yeah. So he's 5'4". Okay, fun fact.
Yeah. So as I remember in the Simo Häyhä episode, you were wanting to give a shout out to badasses of short stature.
Yes. Woo.
So they moved to New York City, or upstate New York. He's in Albany for a while, and he's in New York City. He's doing all kinds of different jobs. He's kind of bouncing around doing different stuff. One job that sticks for him is that he's a porter at Union Station on Broadway in New York City, which is kind of like loading suitcases on and off trains as they come.
Okay. Yeah. Kind of grunt work, but hey, it pays the bills. It's honest work.
Exactly. Right. And in 1918, the United States enters World War I. It's kind of the finishing years of World War I, but the U.S. gets involved, and they're gonna ship out and send people. And there's a call for the New York National Guard to assemble and head off. And Henry Johnson, he decides, okay, this is an opportunity for me, serve my country, make some money, travel the world. Let's do this. So he signs up and he enlists in the 15th New York National Guard, which eventually gets mustered into federal service as the 369th Infantry Division. We will come to know them as the Harlem Hellfighters because they're based in Harlem, New York. And Henry Johnson, he was working on Broadway. The Harlem Hellfighters, they are the army at this point is segregated, right? They're a unit of all African American soldiers with some white officers, but there's 2,000 officers and men, and they are going to get shipped out to go fight in the war. They get on a boat. The boat that they get on that sets sail for Europe, it almost immediately bumps into another ship in the harbor and starts taking on water.
Oh.
And the captain's like, we're going to turn back. And the commander of the 369th is like, no, we're not going to turn back over this. The war's not over for us already. We're going to make it there. And so they got there, and as the commander of the unit wrote, like, we were very happy that the ship made it to France right side up.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the Harlem Hellfighters, they're not called the Harlem Hellfighters yet. They're just called the 369th Infantry Division. But they head out there, and they arrive on the front, and they're ready to join the fight and get in there. But the work that they are given early on, and like I said, this is kind of a segregated unit, they are given they're given all kind of like the grunt work, like you said.
No.
Yeah, they're given unloading cargo ships, digging ditches, just all this kind of...
Could have just stayed back in New York and been a porter and lifted people's suitcases.
Basically what he's doing there, right? He enlisted in the army, and he goes out there and then just kind of... They're kind of being treated like second-class citizens in terms of the work they're getting and all of that, the way they're being treated by command and all of this.
Yeah. So he's doing grunt work. It is grunt work in France,
yes,
but still, it's grunt work.
Yeah. I mean, digging a ditch in France might not be that much more exciting than digging a ditch in New York, but but you're traveling to a new country, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, digging a ditch with Grey Poupon. No.
The wine's better.
Okay, so I'm guessing that he's not resigning himself to a life of digging ditch after ditch after ditch.
No. So a really interesting thing ends up happening here with the 369th, which is that, they are a full strength unit here. There's 2,000 officers and men. They are kind of being given this back end kind of work. And this is 1918. The World War I has been going on for 4 years. The French have lost tens of millions of people in this war, right? And they are like, the French army at some point, they go to the Americans and they're like, look, you have this like fully operational, full strength unit here, and you're not doing anything with them. Can we have them if you're not going to do anything with these guys? Can we borrow them and use them in combat?
So from a pragmatic point of view, it totally makes sense. Is this the sort of request that happens a lot?
This is extremely rare. This is weird and unusual. And in my humble experience with this, it is the only time I have ever come across this of anything happening. Like the French army was like, can we use this unit and load them in on the front lines because we're hemorrhaging gut people everywhere, right? We're in big trouble. We need fresh bodies. And the American army says yes. And so the French army ends up outfitting the 369th with a lot of French gear. Like, so when you see, pictures of the Harlem Hellfighters in Europe, they're not wearing the standard American helmet from World War I. They're wearing a French helmet because they were given that kind of equipment. They're carrying some French gear, and they're technically attached to the French army. And when I had talked about in the open about wanting to get American medals for these guys, like the Medal of Honor, there is the kind of institutionalized racism aspect of we didn't want to award this guy the Medal of Honor, but there is also the literal, like, he was fighting for the French army and he was attached to the French army, not the U.S. army.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a technicality or something.
Sure.
Or,
it's interesting, right? Yeah. But we'll see more of this as we go along. But yeah, super, super unusual.
So yeah. While they're in France, from the Americans weren't being given any good missions, and France is giving them an opportunity for good missions. And let's take a moment to reflect on what makes a good mission good or even great. Clearly, you need a badass soundtrack. So amongst the intrepid members of the 369th was a guy named James Reese Europe, and the members of his band. And in this context, I don't mean a band of soldiers. I mean a band of musicians, like, an orchestra.
Like they brought a band they brought musicians with them. Which I guess you see army bands all the time, right? The changing of the guard and all that, right? But yeah. And these days you have army bands that give just concerts to the public. One of my very good friends from college played tuba for one.
And so we've got this orchestra, the regimental orchestra, the 369th Regimental Army Band. They're not just playing just sort of the usual, patriotic marches on repeat. They're bringing ragtime and jazz to their fellow soldiers and to the good people of France.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it's not, that's interesting. So like, not just, like you said, not just patriotic, the John Philip Sousa or whatever you would think about with this.
Yeah.
But like pop music.
Yes, pop music, like entire new genres,
Yeah.
The new sound, yeah. And Europe. And when I say Europe, I mean James Reese Europe.
Oh, that's
he was hardcore. Huh? It is, yeah. It was a little weird reading about this, when Europe got hit by a gas attack in 1918. We mean James Reese Europe, the band leader. And
also the continent at the same time.
Well, okay, yeah. Well, okay, but this anecdote is going in a very specific direction. He has to, James Reese Europe, the individual, the person has to get taken to the hospital. And while he's there, his fellow musician, who's part of the band, whose name's Neville Sissel, he asks him how he's doing, and James Reese Europe responds, "Well, gee, I am glad to see you boys." This is a quote. Sissel, here's a wonderful idea for a song that just came to me. In fact, it was from the experience I had last night during the bombardment that nearly knocked me out. And he's lying there in his hospital bed and he's just like composing. He's tossing off the song On Patrol in No Man's Land. You know, he's nonstop, you know? Everything is material. Everything is inspiration, apparently.
So James Reese Europe. So when you say he's the head of the army or the regimental band, you picture like that he would be kind of hanging in the back with a trumpet or something, right? But like he's out there getting blown up. He's out there getting bombed. Yeah. So James Reese Europe, the band leader, is out there with the rifle and I assume a trumpet case or something, getting bombed by the Germans. He gets gassed. He gets whatever, chlorine gas or whatever, mustard gas, goes to the hospital with like burned out lungs, which is bad for a musician.
Sounds awful. Yeah.
And then what was the fellow musician's name? Noble Sissel?
Noble Sissel. Yeah.
Which just sounds like a jazz musician's name, right?
Oh, totally.
It sounds like that guy shreds a saxophone.
Yeah.
And he says, "What are you doing?" And James Reese Europe was like, "Well, while I was unconscious, I got this good riff in my head, and now I'm going to turn it into an awesome song."
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is a perfect way of encapsulating how badass the Hellfighters were.
Yeah.
Because once the French employ them in combat, that is what they're going to get. That is the type of man they are going to get.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I don't know, zooming out for a bit, his influence, his badassery isn't just restricted to just this particular moment in time in France. His band was a big factor in getting a lot of really talented musicians, especially Puerto Rican musicians of African ancestry, to settle in New York after the war. And this changes the landscape of Latin music, and the success of the band, the Harlem Hellfighters Army Band, gets the folks on Broadway. Okay, Broadway, we mentioned earlier, is the place where Henry Johnson was working as a porter, but also, as we all know, Broadway's where the musicals happen, it's show business. And
music clubs, like shows, all that stuff.
Yeah. And so the folks on Broadway are realizing that, it's like a good idea to have bands that have Black musicians on a regular basis. And this is a way of opening up opportunities and just opening up the music scene. And James Reese Europe paves the way for all sorts of musicians, Juan Tizol, Duke Ellington. And we're getting ahead of ourselves, right? Because we're back in France in 1918.
Right. But this is kind of what I was just talking about at the intro, where it's like, the United States is a very segregated place when this war begins, even in the North and in the South, like all across the map, there's a divide here. And the actions of the Hellfighters and Henry Johnson and James Reese Europe, they're going to kind of make early steps into kind of closing that divide, which I think is really cool. And under fire, literally, right?
Literally, yeah.
So this is, a good intro to the Hellfighters, because this is what we're going to get with these guys. They enter the Argonne Forest. Hello, cher ami.
Cher ami, yes.
They're going to get positioned in the Argonne Forest alongside French units. So they're sent alongside to kind of reinforce French positions. They're not with the Lost Battalion or the regular U.S. units. They are kind of off by themselves with the French generally. They end up seeing 191 consecutive days of combat, which is...
Oh, wow. That's like over 6 months.
Yeah, months of every single day being on the line, being in combat, right? No rest, no reprieve. It's more consecutive days of combat than any other U.S. unit in World War I. They have 2,000 men and officers when they arrive. Of those, they earn 100 medals for bravery. They are the first Allied regiment of any country to cross the Rhine River into Germany proper towards the end of the war. They win all of these battles. They earn these medals for bravery. They start getting these cool nicknames: the Black Rattlers, the Hommes de Bronze, the Men of Bronze. The one that sticks is Harlem Hellfighters, because that's clearly,
it has a nice ring to it.
It's the best one. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But they start earning a reputation, but it comes with a price. So these guys are fighting, and they're fighting hard, but they suffer 1,500 casualties, and that's wounded and killed and missing. It's the highest casualty rate of any U.S. regiment in the war. Of those 2,000 guys, they get reinforced and stuff, but 1,500 of those guys suffer a wound, not necessarily one that incapacitates them, but probably didn't feel great. But their reputation was able to hold because they're in these really tough conditions. They're in the middle of everything. They're fighting 191 days in a row. They're losing guys left and right. They're tired. But they don't give up. And the saying goes that the Hellfighters, they never lost a foot of ground and never had a man taken prisoner. Apparently, that is, they had 2 guys that were taken prisoner, and they were able to recover both of them. And we're going to tell one of those stories.
Cool.
Right now.
Yeah. So that's a badass reputation.
Yeah. And that's as good as it gets in terms of showing your bravery, right? And
Ben, you mentioned a story.
Yes. Yeah. It is the most badass moment in the history of the Harlem Hellfighters, who you could argue is one of the most badass regiments in the U.S. Army in World War I. But the story we're going to tell takes place on the night of May 14th, 1918. And it's an encounter that will be eventually written up as the Battle of Henry Johnson.
The Battle of Henry Johnson. Usually battles get named after places.
Yeah, generally cities or rivers, weirdly, but
yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Battle of, specifically, Henry Johnson.
This guy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But we'll see why. It is May 14th, 1918. It is late at night in the Argonne Forest. We are in the Champagne region of France, which sounds nice, except that it's kind of a bombed out war zone right now with trenches and artillery and aircraft and machine guns and all of that.
Yeah, anywhere else, this would just be sparkling destruction.
Right. It's got to be from the Champagne region in order to be the Champagne of badass military actions. Henry Johnson is a sergeant, so he was kind of a soft-spoken guy, but he's already clearly shown enough bravery and leadership to be promoted up to a sergeant. He's a sergeant in C Company of the Harlem Hellfighters, and he is on a graveyard sentry duty shift along with a private in the unit named Needham Roberts. They are in Outpost 20. It is nighttime.
Outpost 20.
Outpost 20. It's dark. The battles of the day have ended, and now Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson, they are on the overnight watch. Make sure no trouble happens. They're kind of on the outskirts of the trench, out by themselves, keeping an eye out for trouble. They'll raise the alarm if something happens, and, sentry duty. Well, they're just kind of hanging out, sitting there, looking for trouble, and it shows up. There is a full platoon of German infantry, somewhere between 20 and 40 guys. And they have been sneaking up on these two, and they rush them. It's what's called a trench raid, where the objective here is you have these big lines of trenches, and you have these little sentries that come out there to make sure nothing weird's happening, because at night when it gets dark, some people will sneak out there. They'll plant mines, they'll put out barbed wire, they'll plant little bombs or whatever. You need guards out there to make sure that doesn't happen, to shoot some shots at them to scare them away or alert if there's a nighttime attack or something. But one thing that happens at night is what's called trench raiding, where these guys are there to grab prisoners. So these This group of Germans is here to grab these two guys, or one of them, and bring them back to German lines to interrogate them and get more information about what is going on the French side of the battlefield. If they can get some ideas of where the artillery is or where the machine guns are, maybe they can find a weak point, blah, blah, blah. It's a small scale engagement. It's not a full on attack. It's not a huge war, scenario, but for Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, this is bad news. This is 20 guys. They are outnumbered 10-1 minimum. And okay, here come the Germans. They've snuck up on them in the night and they attack. There's grenades, there's gunfire. Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, they get their rifles, they try to fire back. They have these bolt action rifles. It's not enough. They're overwhelmed. And within seconds, there's Germans in the trenches with them. There's grenades coming over the top. Henry Johnson gets hit with a grenade, which just kind of explodes close to him and puts a bunch of shrapnel in him. German jumps over the trench, sticks him with the bayonet. He's trying to fight these guys off. He gets shot twice in the chest with a revolver. He's down. He's out. He's unconscious.
Wow.
Needham Roberts is fighting off these guys as well, but same thing. They're outnumbered. He takes a shotgun shell to the chest and he goes down as well. That's it. That's the end of that battle. The Germans have won. These two guys are down. Needham Roberts is kind of moving around. He's not dead yet. Henry Johnson is not moving.
Is it the end of Roberts? Is it the end of Johnson?
It seems that way. The Germans leave Johnson for dead. Like he's gone. There's no way that guy's coming back. He got hit with a grenade and a bayonet and two revolver shots. He's done. The other guy's moving around. Maybe we can bring him back, interrogate him. So they grab him and they start to drag him back for interrogation. But here's the thing. Henry Johnson wakes up. He gets up. He peeks out over the trench and he sees these guys kind of like laughing and pulling his buddy off to back to their trench to be interrogated for what the weaknesses in the Hellfighters line, so maybe they can exploit it later. And Henry Johnson, he's very severely wounded. He's very badly injured. But
yeah,
the Harlem Hellfighters,
multiple times.
Yes. From a number of horrifying things that have happened to him just now. Mm-hmm. But the Harlem Hellfighters, they're called the Harlem Hellfighters. They've never lost a foot of ground, and they've never had a man taken prisoner. And Henry Johnson is not about to let that happen right now. He's not about to change that. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to find out what happens to these poor Germans after they made Henry Johnson mad. It is May 14th, 1918. Henry Johnson has been hit with a grenade. He's been stabbed. He's been shot twice at point blank range. And his friend, Needham Roberts, is badly wounded from a shotgun shell and is being carried off by a group of somewhere in the vicinity of 30 German soldiers to be interrogated. Henry Johnson has just basically regained consciousness. He can kind of move around. He gets to his feet. He sees this happening and he does what none of us would do and gets angry and decides he's going to go rescue his friend.
Okay.
What does that look like?
If I were there, I would counsel him to like, no, take care of yourself. You got to heal. You are not in a position to do this.
Nobody would judge you. Nobody would judge you if you were too badly injured to do anything about this. But, Henry Johnson, he's a loyal guy. He's going to go get his guy. He's the sergeant. He's responsible for that private. He's a Hellfighter. They're on the same team. Can't, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what these Germans are going to do? We got to get him. Okay.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And also, if the Germans are interrogating their prisoners, he wants to get Roberts back to keep him safe, but also he doesn't want the Germans to get too much information out of him. Yeah,
true. Yeah, that's bad for him too, right? And for the rest of his unit. So what does Henry Johnson do? He stands up, he pulls his grenades, he starts running after these guys yelling, starts throwing his grenades, starts shooting his rifle, which is a bolt action, so it doesn't shoot super rapidly, but it does the job. He starts charging after these guys, screaming, and it takes them a minute to realize what's happening. They turn around and some of these guys are getting hit with grenades, some of them are getting hit with rifles, and before they know it, just as they had jumped into his trench and surprised him, Henry Johnson has jumped into their trench and surprised them. He's got...
Oh, how the tables have turned.
Yes. He is shooting people with his rifle, and when his rifle jams, he starts swinging his rifle around like a baseball bat, hitting people with it. And when he breaks his rifle on a German, he's out of grenades. He's out of his rifle's broken. His bullets are worthless right now. What does he do? Well, it just so happens that he is carrying a 12-inch bolo knife on him. And
a bolo knife?
Yes.
Now, it's a bolo knife. Like, specifically, what is a bolo knife?
Well, this is a good time to take a break for a second and look at the history of the bolo knife, which is a weapon that was in use in World War I by the U.S. Army. We don't see it as much anymore, but a bolo knife is a weapon of Filipino invention. So this is something that dates back to the Philippines War, when the U.S. was occupying the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. The Philippines became a U.S. territory, and there were some people who lived there that didn't like that and revolted against the U.S. occupation. And the U.S. Army sent troops there. In fact, Blackjack Pershing, the guy who was currently in command of the U.S. Army in World War I, he kind of got the reputation for being Blackjack while he was, taking some pretty harsh measures with the resistance in the Philippines. So a bolo knife is basically a machete. It's a 12-inch, like Jason Voorhees kind of. It's used to hack open coconuts. You can use it to kind of thresh rice, clear brush in the Philippines. It's a big...
Sounds useful.
Yeah, it's a sword. And
okay. It's a sword that you use for daily functions.
Right. It's a utility device, right? I mean, it probably helped a lot while you were like digging trenches and, cutting ropes and stuff like that. It's 1918. You're not supposed to fight the war with this thing, but it is a tool that you carry with you. It's a
thing that you have, yeah.
Right. And when the U.S. was fighting the guerrillas in the Philippines, those guys were coming at Americans with this, which was very effective if you could get close enough, but and effective enough at close range that the U.S. Army began to implement it because they're like, actually, this worked pretty well in close quarters. It's kind of a nice thing to have because it is a weapon, but it's also a tool. Well, Henry Johnson, in this moment, he's using it as a weapon. So let's picture this guy. He's not a huge guy. He's in this trench with 20 minus however many Germans, and he is fighting them with a sword. And they are trying to fight him back, but he's a machine. We don't have all the details of this. We know that over the course of what is about to happen, he will be wounded 21 times. And that includes the grenade and the shot, the wounds he's already taken. By the time the battle is over, he will have been wounded 21 times. But
that's a lot.
Yes. But he kills 4 Germans with the bolo knife, including their commanding officer. 12 other Germans are wounded by various means, the grenades and the rifles and all of that stuff. And the last dozen or so guys, they decide they don't want any more of this guy and they run away.
Makes sense in the circumstances. Yeah.
Yes. Henry Johnson has jumped into this trench. He is severely wounded before the fight has even begun. He is fighting with a knife against guys with guns.
So he literally brought a knife to a gunfight.
Literally brought a knife to a gunfight and won. He inflicted 16 casualties on the Germans and drove away at least 10 more, possibly more, probably more. And more importantly, he rescues Needham Roberts, who is not dead and who will not die from these wounds. He will survive this. He will survive the war. Okay.
Yeah, and rescuing Roberts was the whole point of this exercise in the first place.
Exactly. And so my favorite thing with this is, Henry Johnson is in here, he's fighting, he's doing heroic stuff. And then the way I imagine the movie going here is just a hard cut to the next morning, because the story goes that when the morning shift arrived to relieve Roberts and Johnson from their graveyard shift sentry duty, the morning shift arrives, the sun's coming up. Johnson and Needham Roberts are sitting around a campfire, severely wounded, but they're sitting there and they're playing music and they're singing those jazz songs that we talked about earlier. Like nothing had happened.
Oh wow.
They are, of course, taken to the hospital as you'd expect.
I would hope so. Yeah.
And Henry Johnson, he's laying in the hospital. Him and Roberts, they get transferred to the hospital. They're badly wounded, but they're okay and they're going to live. And they start to recover. And, the days and the weeks go by. They have some surgeries. They shout out to, I guess we did Marie Curie recently with the x-rays and the resetting bones and all of that stuff. That is the French army, and it's possibly one of her aid stations. We don't know. We can't say for sure that this is a confluence of badasses, but Jeremy and Marie Curie and Henry Johnson all in the Argonne, all in the Champagne region of France together.
Yeah.
Sounds like the setup to a joke.
It does, actually. Yeah.
So they're recovering and they're starting to do better. And then something weird happens. Henry Johnson starts getting letters from people back in the US saying like, hey, good job. Like, thanks for your service, that kind of stuff. And he's like, well, yeah. He's like, what's going on here? And then he starts getting more letters and more
How do they
and more
know?
letters.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's happening? And it turns out that at some point, and this was weeks after the battle had happened, the French kind of declassified the details of what was happening. And Henry Johnson's story started getting picked up by magazines in the US. The Saturday Evening Post ran him with like artwork. They drew pictures of him fighting these Germans and him and Roberts fighting these Germans. And there's some very heroic artwork of them. Of course, they drew them all in the US gear rather than the French gear that they were wearing because now they're American heroes. We talked about this a little bit with Marie Curie last week where like, you're our heroes when we want you to be our heroes.
U.S. audiences.
So,
yeah.
They give him a nickname. They call him the Black Death, which is a pretty cool nickname for Henry Johnson.
Whoa.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there. Yeah. Okay.
But they're not just being appreciated in the US, but so they start becoming kind of celebrities. Like a lot of people are really impressed by these stories. These are American war heroes fighting in France on the front lines with the Germans. Like that hasn't happened very much. And, in 1918, we kind of think of the US as being a kind of a global military presence now, but in 1918, that wasn't the case. Like American war hero having success in a foreign country, that was weird. We hadn't really done much of that by this point in time.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And in fact, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, they become the first Americans ever to receive the Croix de Guerre, which is the French Medal of Honor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they get that for this battle. And they're we'll see a bunch of Americans will get it for fighting in World War II, but it's really, really uncommon in World War I. And Roberts and Johnson are the first ones to get it for the heroics of this battle. Now, Henry Johnson is very badly wounded, and because he's kind of attaining some sort of notoriety and he's an award-winning guy now and he's a war hero, he gets offered to be brought home. The U.S. government says, hey, let's bring you home. He says, no, I'm not going to go back. I don't want to be separated from my unit. He doesn't want to be separated from the Hellfighters. And he carries out the rest of the war with them. He spends most of the rest of the war in the hospital recovering. And when he is capable of moving around again, they don't really kind of send him out to the front again because he's really not in great shape for that. But he finishes the war with the 369th, with the Hellfighters. And when they arrive back home, they take another boat back to the States. And when they get back, they receive a parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. Because they are New York National Guard. They are local heroes in New York City, and they get to go back to Harlem, and they go down New York. They go down Broadway. They go down everything, right? And this time they're heroes because of all of the heroic stuff that they did fighting the Germans in World War I. And that's kind of a turning point. And then, like you said, James Reese Europe, he gets involved with music, and he kind of ends up transforming the music scene in the city and by extension the world, introducing, kind of bringing in jazz music and kind of bring it to the forefront of people's minds. And and paving the way for a lot of
like the forefront of their minds, and like the rest of, tapping their toes.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. I mean, this changes music forever, right?
Bopping with it. Yeah.
And so what happens to Henry Johnson after the war? He's pretty badly wounded still. He becomes a public speaker. So one thing that he starts doing is traveling around. He was a war hero. He had the Croix de Guerre. He's being asked to like go places and talk about his experience in the war. And so he goes there and he goes to these different places and he starts talking about his experiences in the war. And one thing with Henry Johnson is that he's a no BS kind of guy. He gets out there and he's like, yeah, it was hard. It's like the white soldiers didn't want to share the trench with the black soldiers. So we had our own little area, and that made it really hard for us.
Real talk.
Yes. And the army is like, actually, we don't want you to say that. We want you to make us look a little nicer than that. And he doesn't, and he stops getting asked to do these talks. And in fact, at one point, they actually fine him for wearing his uniform after he was demobilized, which I guess you're not supposed to do. But that seems really lame, right?
Yeah, that seems gratuitous. Anyway.
Yeah. So his wounds kind of bug him. He has a little bit of trouble finding work because he's kind of walking with a limp. He was wounded 21 times in battle, right? He shouldn't be out there like loading luggage onto a train again.
For people.
No.
Yeah.
He gets TB. He has some health problems. He dies in 1926. And he's in his mid-30s at this point. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And for a long time, that was kind of the end of the story. For years, it just kind of, that was it. But there was a big fight and a big movement to try to get Henry Johnson recognized for his efforts by the U.S. Army. He'd gotten the Croix de Guerre from the French Army, but, he's an American war hero. He should have gotten something, some sort of medal, even a Purple Heart for like being wounded in action, right? There'd been nothing. And a lot of people worked really hard to fight for this. And in the 90s, which we're talking
more than half a century later.
Right. So in the 90s, like some 70 something years after he passed away, he's eventually given the Purple Heart, which is literally just that you were wounded in the service of your country, which, okay, that's the least you can do, but at least there's something, right?
Yeah.
And eventually, a lot of this hard work from a lot of these very dedicated soldiers, they do end up getting him recognized with a Medal of Bravery from the U.S. government. He earns the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002. And Henry Johnson's son is actually there to receive the medal. His son was a Tuskegee Airman, actually, Pat.
Oh, wow. So a second generation of excellence.
Yes. Tuskegee Airmen are also a very badass unit.
The incredibly elite African-American fighter pilots and support staff in World War II, including flight surgeons, which was a big deal.
Yeah.
And they totally kicked ass. And they earned 3 distinguished unit citations, 96 distinguished flying crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 air medals, and at least 60 Purple Hearts. But that's beside the point. We're talking about Henry Johnson.
Yes. And so, his son received the medal in 2002 on his behalf, which was an awesome moment. That was around the time I picked up the story for my website and I started writing. I wrote about him, I think, in 2004, maybe, because this had just kind of come to pass. And, the book came out in 2009, I believe. And then it wasn't until 2015 that the campaign continued. The people who had worked hard to get him recognized, they didn't give up.
Yeah.
And in 2015, the award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor for, quote, conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, which sounds about right to me.
Intrepidity. Yes. Being intrepid. I think that's the first time I've encountered that word, but I have to say it's clear what it means, and it's clear that Henry Johnson illustrates it.
Yes, I agree. The award, Henry Johnson's son had passed away by that point, but the award was received by one of the people who had worked really hard to get Henry Johnson's medal recognized and his valor recognized. Command Sergeant Major Lewis Wilson of the Newark Army National Guard was able to accept the award. So it was the same unit that he had fought for. Yeah, he was Newark National Guard, and the Newark National Guard, he was good to the Hellfighters, and they made sure that he got the award that he deserved. And so he was able to receive that in person, which was really awesome. And, the story for Henry Johnson, it continues. In 2023, actually, Fort Polk in Louisiana was actually renamed Fort Johnson after Henry Johnson. And so it's really cool to get to see him receiving some recognition, even this far after 100 years after the actions that he had in the Argonne Forest that day.
Yeah.
So that is the story of the Battle of Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters. We really had a good time telling it, and we really hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. If you do, please don't forget to like and subscribe and do all that stuff, because as much as we say that all the time, it actually really does help the show out, and we could really use the support. So we appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for listening to this, and we really look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Stay badass.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larish, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.